Ephesians chapter 5. Do you have any fears? Several years ago, Dave Pettit preached a sermon. Maybe it was a couple sermons, but it was really dealing with fear. And he listed several fears and phobias that people have. What do you fear? There's arachnophobia, the fear of spiders. I've given you several here. There's acrophobia and aerophobia, the fear of heights, the fear of flying. I'm not going to pronounce this one right, but ophidiophobia, you can read it there. The fear of snakes. Some people like snakes, others don't. You may go to the doctor and have this fear, trypanophobia. That's the fear of the needle. You don't like injections. There's misophobia. Now, misophobia. I told my kids last night, misophobia is the fear of becoming Jar Jar Binks. And if you know anything about Star Wars, you may understand that one. But literally, misophobia is the fear of germs. And the ones that they have to overcome today, the teens, is glossophobia, which is the fear of public speaking. All kinds of phobias out there. What makes you afraid? That word fear is the word that kept coming back to me as I prepared our message for this morning. Not because the word is in our text, but because the text can cause great fear in people. It's our text that starts with verse 22 in Ephesians chapter 5. There we read, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husband as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, let the wives be subject to their own husbands in everything." Ladies, do those words make you afraid? For some they do. And for some, it's because of the culture in which we live. I heard this week that it was JFK, President John Kennedy, who's credited as a major player in the establishment of our modern feministic movement when he, in 1961, established the President's Commission on the Status of Women. And really, ever since then, there has been an attack on our culture in our society, every corner of our society. And it's trickled even down into our homes to where the sheer mention of this word submit causes great fear and great alarm. I'm not here to add to that fear today. But if anything, what I hope to do is alleviate some of that fear so that by the time that we're done, at least we have a better understanding what it is to be a Spirit-filled, submissive wife. The title of my message is The Spirit-Filled Wife. But before I go to my first point, I think I need to gather back some of the ground that we tread last week and remind us of the discussion on submission. And if you'll remember, that was a sermon on verse 21, which says, "Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God." Now that verse is the umbrella by which the rest of this discussion falls under. And if you follow the rest of this discussion, chapter 5, verse 22, all the way down to chapter 6, verse 9, it would appear that this discussion is about submission in the context of the family, but I would submit, really, it's not about the family. I would submit that this passage, this discussion, really is about the relationships we have with other people, which involves the most intimate and vulnerable of all the relationships we have with other people. And as such, these words, these verses that we are going to enter in over the next few weeks, these verses serve as instructions for us to know what it is to be Spirit-filled believers who submit to one another. Relationships, they're the key to these verses, and we see that in how they are presented. You see in chapter 5, verses 22 to 33, the relationship of wives and husbands. When we turn the corner into chapter 6, you see the relationships with children and their parents. And then even in chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, you see this relationships with slaves and their masters. In each of these relationships, there is a call to be submissive in the way that we are Spirit-filled. Now, I go over that because context matters. And if we are not careful, we could be guilty of pulling in other things and make this passage say things that it does not say. But in the context of our audience, the context of Ephesians, the context of the believers that it's being written to, these people, they are believers. But they're not just believers. They're not carnal believers. These are believers who have at least the desire to be Spirit-filled. And what Paul is giving is just simple instructions of evidence and result. How you can know when that takes place. How you can know what Spirit-filling looks like. But when we lose our perspective, when we start pulling in other things and pulling it out of its own context, lots of bad preaching can and lots of bad preaching does take place. And that has contributed a lot to the fear and the fear-mongering, the spiritual abuse that wives have submitted to as they come to worship the Lord. I don't know how to calculate this. I tried to do a search and I broke the internet. I couldn't find it. But in my experience, maybe you could say the same. In my experience, I think I've heard more sermons on the wife's relationship with her husband than I have the husband's role to love his wife. And sadly, I think that this text, the text that you find in Colossians chapter 3, I think you find these are the ones that are most exploited because they're easily picked. But no doubt, the Bible does have lots to say about wives submitting to unbelieving husbands, carnal believing husbands, unspiritual husbands. The Bible has a lot to say about those things, but it's not in the context of this passage. So, as we approach the passage, just kind of walking into the water, what I want to do is kind of keep this focus that Paul is addressing believers. But he's addressing believers who at least have a desire to be Spirit-filled. And that comes into play with the roles that we fill. So today we're going to address Spirit-filled wives. And my first point is this, that the Spirit-filled wife submits, arranges herself under her husband voluntarily. That's what you find in verse 22. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husband as unto the Lord. I don't know if you can see it there, but there is a call for you ladies. And that call to submit is not a command in the sense that you are subjected to a husband who is your dictator. Sometimes we're told that, or at least it's admonished that way. This is not a command in the sense that your husband is your dictator. This is a call for you to voluntarily, volitionally act as a free agent. It is a call for you to willingly, voluntarily submit to him. In other words, this is not forced. And if I could give an illustration, we think in pictures. If I could give an illustration, I understand this is going to be a silly illustration, But let me see if I can illustrate it in the terms of Shady Maple. Have you ever been to Shady Maple? Why do you go to Shady Maple? I'm not sure if it's for the food or for the event. I mean, when you pull up to that, it's like a city block of nothing but a buffet. I mean, it's huge. When you go to that buffet, no one's going to stand over you and say, eat that broccoli. See that fish? You better put it on your plate. Now, moms, you may do that with your children because you don't want all tan. You know, if your plate's all tan, that's probably not a good thing. But no one stands over you and says, don't eat that steak. Do you know what that's going to do to your cholesterol? No one says, you better eat that ice cream. You get to go through that buffet. And if you like Brussels sprouts, I don't know who would, but if you like Brussels sprouts, put them on your plate. You can eat them. If you want the fish or you want the ham, whatever you want, that whole room is a buffet for you to go and choose what you want. And if you don't want it, don't eat it. But if you do want it, go ahead and put it on your plate. Just pile it on. You can do it. In many ways, this is the illustration of a wife who voluntarily submits to her husband. Not that she gets to pick and choose. She gets the choice as a Spirit-filled wife. She has the choice to submit, range herself under, or reject that submission and cause trouble. And Paul is saying, be subject to one another, be submissive to one another, because this is an evidence of the Spirit filling you. This is an evidence of belief that is within you. This is an evidence that God has changed you and made you a believer. This is an evidence that you have put off and you're put on. This is an evidence that you're growing in the grace and knowledge of God. You who are called to be like Christ need to be Spirit-filled. And if you are going to be Spirit-filled, you have a choice. That choice is to submit voluntarily under your husband. Somebody says, well, I like that illustration because I'll submit to him when he says, let's go for ice cream. But if he tells me to go and clean the tub, then I'm not doing that. Don't run too far. Because verse 24 gives us the context where we are to submit. Verse 24, therefore as the church is subject to Christ, so let our wives be subject to their own husbands. Where? In everything. Houston, we have a problem. We have a problem because Paul says this is a voluntary thing. He is not commanding you to submit. He's calling you as a Spirit-filled believer to arrange yourself under Him, and yet you're to do it in everything. Somebody says, well, you just said I could choose. Yes, but you choose whether to submit to Him or not. And when you choose to do so, that choice is complete. You just arrange yourself under Him in everything. And the test of your being filled with the Spirit is when you do not agree. That's the test of your submission. But a Spirit-filled wife submits to her husband voluntarily. And it looks like this. I'm going to give you another illustration. It looks like this. How do you school your children? In my opinion, this is unscientific, but in my opinion, there are at least 4 great evils out there. There's homeschool, there's Christian school, there's public school, and there's any other school. How do you school your children? When it comes down to the education that you will give them, both of you need to be involved in that conversation. And both of you are going to grow in that, and you're going to try to find all of the angles. These are all the positives. These are the negatives. You may list them on a piece of paper, but in the midst of that conversation, eventually you will funnel that down to decide one of those 4 great evils. But it may be that when all is said and done, your husband says, honey, I hear what you have to say, but I think we ought to fill in the blank. Homeschool. You may have reservations about that. You may be concerned with some of the influences or the lack of socialization that will happen in that. You may have concern because you don't feel qualified for that. None of that is a sinful thing, but a Spirit-filled wife says, okay, it's not involving sin. I'll trust you for that. Now, I've purposely picked schooling as the illustration because most of you are not there. Either your children are already gone, they're grown, they're married, they have their own children, or maybe your children are too small still, but in the end, really the illustration is not about schooling. In the end, the illustration is about your relationship with Christ. No one is going to stand before the Lord one day and hear, why did you homeschool your children? He's not going to say that. But you may hear, why did you stand against your husband in these matters? You may hear God explain. Now again, I don't know the mind of God. I'm not trying to assume the mind of God. But you may hear God explain to you that He's orchestrating all things, your life and the life of your family. He's orchestrating the life of your husband. He's orchestrating the lives of your children. And even though you may not have known it, it may be that He was directly involved in guiding your husband's steps because he has a flaw and He was trying to make a man out of him. He was trying to make a leader out of him. It could be that you hear that He was working to prepare your son or your daughter through the experiences of those things for the mission field. It could have been that He was looking to bring another family to Him through the testimony of your family. At every turn, though, you throw up hurdles, you throw up barriers, you throw up resistance. And in that resistance, though He is sovereign, He will make a man out of your husband. And He'll make him a leader, but He's going to have to work that man over in maybe different ways. It could be that He still calls your son to the mission field, but it's going to take him longer to learn those lessons that God had for him as he prepared. It could be that He is going to save that family, but He's going to do it a different way. Ladies, there's an illustration that can break down. But the application is not meant to be an emotional burden, but really it's for us to consider your call. Are you a child of God? Are you a believer who wants to grow in the grace and knowledge of Christ, becoming more like Him? Are you a wife? If you're a wife, you are called to voluntarily arrange yourself under your believing husband so long as he's not leading you to sin. And here's why. Verse 23. The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and He is the Savior of the body. What Paul is getting into is this, that the Spirit-filled wife ultimately submits to Christ. When I read that verse 23, that the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, I read that and tempted to think in terms of head as a ruler or as an authority. And that wives are to submit to their husbands because they are the wives' ruling authority. And I hear that, and that sounds so archaic. I hear that, and it sounds so harsh. And I hear that, and it just doesn't sound right, that there's a lot of wrong there, and maybe there is. Because really, this term is not really speaking of head as an authority, like a potentate. This term is connected with another term in this verse that's found at the end of this verse. The head is connected with the body. In one sense, the head does have authority over the rest of the body. My head tells my feet to walk. My head tells my hands to pick things up. My head tells my body what to do. And I have lots of other members of my body, but the head does seem to have authority over the body in a sense that it tells the body what to do. But in another sense, the head is just a member like everything else. I mean, we have eyes and ears and nose and fingers and toes and knees and elbows and everything else. The head is just another member of my body. And yet that head, it has a prominent position. So prominent that I can live without certain members of my body. I mean, lop off an ear and I can still live. Lop off a toe or a leg and I can still live. But you lop off my head, I've got problems. The head has a prominent position in your body. You can't lop it off and still function. This word head seems to carry the meaning, not of authority, as in like a potentate. This word head carries the meaning of prominence and preeminence. And just like Christ is the head of the church, the head of the body, so husbands are the head of the wife. One man said, in God's administration, the role of the husband's headship is positional power. His headship and his wife's submission are for the sake of harmony. And isn't that what we want? Harmony at home. What Paul is saying is that the husband has a great responsibility. He is responsible for her. He is her head. And that has great meaning for us, but it also has a lot of meaning for the Ephesians that may be lost on us, because these Ephesians are living in a Roman culture, and we don't live there. But in Paul's day, these people that he's writing to lived in a culture where a man left his father and mother and cleaved to his wife, but the father never relinquished his enthronement, his entitlement, his authority over his daughter. Even after they were married in this Roman culture, a father could call for a daughter's In Roman culture, a father could call for a daughter's divorce from her husband regardless of consent. Regardless of the knowledge of son-in-law or even daughter. The husband had the right, not the husband, the father had the right because he had the authority, the prominence, the position. He never relinquished that. He was the daughter's head. Paul is actually correcting that thinking, and Paul is going back to Genesis chapter 2, speaking of a man leaving father and mother and cleaving to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. What Paul is teaching is that you husbands are the head of your family, and the weight and the responsibility is upon your shoulder. You are the leader of your home. Someone has to lead. And you men are the leaders. You can't have two leaders, because a two-headed anything is a monster. And the leader at home should be the husband. And the reason he's going over this is because these believers, they seek to grow in the grace and knowledge of Christ. They seek to be Spirit-filled. So verse 28 is going to speak of the husband and view his responsibility this way. Husbands, you being the head of your wife, you are to love your wife like you love your own body. We'll get there and we'll preach to you in a few weeks. But when we come to love our own body, what do you do for your body? You keep it, you care for it. You stand in the mirror and just make sure it is perfect. You do whatever's necessary to make yourself better. And as the head of your wife, there's your job. And while you are helping her, she arranges herself under you. In the context, both the husband and the wife desiring to be Spirit-filled, but what we find, it's not a matter of you being the dictator, men, and she obeying all of your wishes. What we find is it's ultimately a matter of us serving God, serving Christ, because we transcend the horizontal. We look to the Lord and we serve Him. So, you wives, you're arranging yourself under your husband's leadership, but ultimately you're arranging yourself under the Lord. And we see that in verse 24. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. What he's saying is, as you arrange yourself and submit yourself to his leadership, others will see. And others are going to take notice, and others are going to want to have what you have because the culture doesn't give that to them. They are seeing you reflect the light of God, and they want it because they're desirous of this Spirit filling. You ladies, arrange yourself under your husbands in everything. Now, I said I was going to meddle, right? Let me give you some concluding applications. And when I'm done, you may want to slug me at the door, kick me in the shin. I understand. You're welcome to do that. But really, the application needs to be given because we live in a world that we don't hear these things. And really, we're dealing with relationships, and relationships can get messy. So I want to be careful how I give the application because I can't foresee all the problems that are out there. And certainly, I may cause more problems with this, getting more worms out of the proverbial can. And if that's the case, come find me in my office this week. I'll try to give you the best advice I can from the Bible. But as we conclude, let me address two things where you ladies could help your husband as you arrange yourself under him. I hope that it will help your relationship at home. You ready? Ladies, I would say this. Arrange yourself under your husbands in your appearance. I didn't talk to her about this, and she's going to slug me when I get home, but my wife grew up in a very godly home. And I love my in-laws, especially if they're watching this recording. I love my in-laws. But when we were married, I discovered that my wife had hardly ever worn a pair of pants. She was raised in the culotte generation. Some of you kids don't even know what culottes are. And for her to put on a pair of pants when we were married, it was not a matter of preference. It was a conscience issue for her. And it took a lot of time and a lot of discussions, and it took our sitting down and going through Scripture and relating certain things, but in time, she's come to understand that it really is not about fabric. That it really is not about one hole you put your legs through or two holes you put your legs through, that really such an issue about clothing is about modesty. And you could be modest with a skirt on or culottes on just as much as you could be immodest with pants on. I think I mentioned this several years ago, that one preacher who really preached hard against women wearing pants once said that his wife was more modest standing on her head with a dress than she'd ever be with pants. And you know what I call that man? A fool. Because fabric is not the issue. Modesty is. And over time, as she arranged herself under my leadership, she learned to be free from an oversensitive conscience. Now, I want to be cautious, because you may be one who never wears pants. And I say that's not a problem. That's okay, so long as it's your preference, not a bound conscience. And if you have a bound conscience in that, I would refer you to Acts chapter 10 that speaks about Peter eating meat that is considered unclean. And there, Christ has to unbind a conscience that is bound unnecessarily. The Lord teaches him that it's not the food that makes you unclean, it's your heart within inside you that makes you unclean. It's not the wearing of pants or skirts. It really is a spiritual matter that goes on in your heart. In the end, ladies, you have blind spots. We all do. And in those blind spots, we can't see, or I'm going to put it a personal you. You can't see what your husband can. And we'll again discuss the men in a couple weeks. Next week we have a missionary, but we'll discuss the men in a couple weeks. But his calling is to overcome some of the weights and the sins that so easily beset you. When it comes to your appearance, I would say this: ladies, arrange yourself under the leadership of your husband. Now, that does not mean you can't have a discussion. That does not mean that you can't have plenty of discussions. But if he desires to be Spirit-filled, his goal is to make you better. And when it comes to your appearance, be careful how you resist. That's true with what you wear. That's true with how much makeup you put on. I told you I was going to meddle. That's true. Now you're going to really kick me in both shins. That's true with how much weight you put on and carry around. Now, I would have us think about the Proverbs. When our children were little, there were some of those early chapters in Proverbs we wouldn't read, because those early chapters in Proverbs, they speak of a seductive woman. And it speaks to the men who see and hear and smell. And yes, he has responsibility, but the point of those chapters is that there are people out there that are trying to seduce anyone that will come their way. We live in a world where husbands, your husband, may work in an environment where there are pictures and calendars Certainly, there are billboards that he's going to drive by, and there's going to be commercials that he's going to hear on the radio, commercials that he's going to see on television, and those are going to be full of just double meaning. It's a culture where sex sells and just bombards us all day long, every day, men and women. Lady, when your husband comes home, what does he see? I tell you what he sees. He sees his bride. The one that he stood at an altar and made a covenant before God and all those witnesses, for better or for worse. So I can tell you this. He's not hoping to show up from work at home one day and find the swimsuit wife. That's not what he's looking for. What he is maybe, possibly though, secretly wishing and hoping is that you would at least put some effort into wooing him and seducing him just like you once did. Someone says, "That's so sexist. You don't get 2 kicks in the shin. You get a punch in the jaw for that." Okay. Punch me in the jaw. But I just want to be real plain. The Bible warns us. It encourages us, and it certainly has something to say about this. And all I'm trying to say is, ladies, you learn to arrange yourself under your husband in your appearance. Slug me at the door. But if it helps the conversation at home and it helps your marriage, it's worth it. How do you look to him? What table conversations are going to go on today? I would say this too. Ladies, number 2, learn to arrange yourself under your husband with your words. And by words, I also mean demeanor, actions. Men, we're going to have to address this. And we'll address this in a couple of weeks. But ladies, you're first up this week. But I know a pastor. He's probably in his 70s now, close to it. And by his own testimony, he talks about when he and his wife were first married, his wife constantly gave verbal speed bumps. What is a speed bump? You know what a speed bump is? It's an annoyance. But it's also something that causes great damage if you hit it too hard. And he says, my wife was just giving these verbal speed bumps. He said, every time I had an idea, it could be any idea. He said, my wife would always come back with a negative statement. He could say, honey, let's go for ice cream. We can't go for ice cream. We can't afford it. We don't have money for it. Honey, let's go on vacation at the beach. Oh, I don't like going to the beach. It's sandy, and I don't like sand. It gets everywhere. Honey, let's go shop at Giant. Why would we go to Giant? Weiss is closer. There's just this constant verbal speed bump. It wasn't that she just completely resisted. Okay, if you need to go to Giant, let's go to Giant. If you want to go to the beach, let's go to the beach. But I told you so everywhere. So that went on early in our marriage until finally I addressed it with her. You know what I found when I addressed it with her? She was mad, angry, and gave a cold shoulder for about 2 weeks. And after those 2 weeks, he says, I'll never forget this. After these 2 weeks, I remember her coming to me in great apology and saying that she was wrong. That over the last 2 weeks, she has been watching what she says to him. And he's right. She didn't see it. These verbal speed bumps. He pointed out a flaw, a blind spot. She repented. And his testimony is that that was a monumental turning in their home. There is now harmony in that marriage. Ladies, it doesn't mean that you can't ever disagree, but it implores you to hear honest feedback. It implores you to be vulnerable, to listen to what your husband says. He is your friend. And faithful are the wounds of a friend. It's not very faithful of a friend that will allow someone to just keep going, barreling on a bad track. Many a man's ministry has been derailed because a wife doesn't know how to keep her own tongue. So you need to be vulnerable, and you need to hear honest feedback. But again, that means you need to give careful attention to your tone, to your demeanor. Honey, what's wrong? Nothing. Okay. Be careful. Some wives, now again, I'm highlighting this. You can punch me, bruise me, whatever you want, but some wives, they will literally ask their husbands for help. And when the help is given, what they find is harsh words. To the point that the husband, they're no longer willing to help, because every time I know she wants me to say, but every time I do say, I get my head bitten off. I'm not willing to do that. Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Ladies, I would say, arrange yourself under your husband and how he wants you to appear. Arrange yourself under your husband in how and what you say, with your words, with your spirit, with your demeanor. I think if you give attention to those two things, now there's more. You give attention to those two things, you know what I think you'll find? Exactly what you want. Harmony at home. Because I think as you continually allow God to show you your blind spots, allow God to have those who are the closest relationship with you to come in and help you to see some of the things you cannot see, to put off and to put on. I think what you will find is that if you allow yourself to submit yourself to the authority, not in the sake of a dictator, but the leadership of your husband, you will find harmony at home. Because what you'll find is a spirit filling. Let the slugfest begin. But before we do, let me close with a word of prayer for my own life and yours. Let me pray to ask the Lord to help us all to submit to one another, because in the end, we submit to Christ. Let's pray.